Um, I'm John Mallery from MIT Artificial Intelligence and Computer Science Lab, and today we're going to have a little discussion on the Pax Sinica and whether it's a new normal for the international economy. And why don't you introduce yourself,
Hi,
Samir?
I'm Samir Patil. I am a fellow for International Security Studies at Gateway House, Mumbai.
And so the hottest issue today is the trade question, which we see between the U.S. and China. Um, what are the views, in India on this on this issue?
So, obviously, one of the key questions dominating the US-China trade dispute is the other sub-question of 5G and the way the US-China spat has played out on that particular front. And obviously, India has right now not taken any sides on the issue. But even though we have our own 5G trials commencing next month, and that does not include any Chinese company. So we have the Nokia, Ericsson, and Samsung participating in the 5G trials. So that, in a sense, tells you where the Indian policy is going on that particular issue. But looking at it, I think the Chinese dominance, there is a realization that, yes, that is probably an inevitable reality. Also because if you see at the Indian market, the smartphone market and the technology market, the smartphone market is dominated by the Chinese companies. Huawei is there, there is Xiaomi is there, and a couple of other Chinese brands are there, which control like 70 to 80% of the Indian smartphone market. But the other interesting part is also the Chinese investments in the technology sector. When we have seen a lot of the Chinese investments in the startup and the fintech sectors. One of the largest mobile wallet or the virtual wallet operators in India is a company called as Paytm, which through its multiple layers of investment has an ownership coming back to the Alibaba group. So there is a realization that Chinese are dominating, and then we'll have to take a very cautious stand when it comes to the US-China trade dispute. I think the other issue that I look at in terms of the Chinese dominance is the way the Chinese have played it so far, that they were able to take a very strategic view of the entire issue in terms of what are the kind of technologies which are going to dominate the global economy or the digital economy in the next 15 to 20 years. And if you rewind to some 2 decades back, they placed an emphasis in terms of the rare earth minerals market, they focus in terms of the high-end equipment manufacturing. 5 years back or 4 years back, they focus in terms of the innovation. So they knew that they took a very strategic view of these things, just like the US, for instance. But and plus, if you look at the Chinese acquisition of the various artificial intelligence machine learning companies in US and Europe. So I think that in a way they put it all together bits by bits to make sure that they are ending up where they are today.
Well, I think that's right. So China is a mass mobilization society, and the Chinese will tell you that, and uh, and they certainly have a Marxist economic development program, and such programs are more aggressive than non-Marxist ones, and so you have the 5-year plans and so forth, and they look to the U.S. in many respects because they think the U.S. is number one in many fields. And their main idea is that they will figure out what the U.S. is doing, and then they will do it bigger and better and surpass the U.S., regardless of what the sector is. So that's the heuristic. And then we see them pursuing in their 5-year plans new industries, strategic industries. You can look at renewable energy. They put a lot of effort into that. But the country is essentially a non-market economy in many respects um, because the state can directly influence a lot of the activity. A substantial component of state-owned enterprises. The last numbers I think I have are from about 2014 or so. And the numbers were that they're in the economy, it was 50% state-owned enterprise, 30% private enterprise, and 20% quasi-private. And under the under Deng Xiaoping, they had moved to open up and reform and use the market mechanism more, but there was they don't like uncertainty, and markets can introduce uncertainty, and so the party reacts to that. Under Xi Jinping, it seems that many of the Deng innovations have been discarded, and there seems to be more focus on the state-owned enterprise sector. And yet, there was a study done in the Peterson Institute around 2014 looking at the relative growth rates of these different parts of the economy. And the study showed that, in fact, the private sector was the most dynamic and was growing at something like 9% a year, whereas the state-owned sector was much slower at 3%. So when we think about the international trading system, which was set up after World War II, it was responding to the problem of the 1930s, which led to World War II, in which countries engaged in competitive devaluations to improve their international trade position and trade wars, which then beggared their neighbors and led to conflict. If we look at the Chinese model, as it were, and the recent trade conflict with the United States, you can look at the USTR 301 report from March 2018. USTR is the United States Trade Representative, which is a part of the White House, and it's in charge of trade, all trade negotiations and so forth. In it, they found that Chinese behavior involved unfair trade practices, and they have a long list of them. But the primary one that they were concerned with was large-scale cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property and trade secrets. Another one they were concerned about was coercion of foreign investors in China to hand over their technologies, so in a joint venture context. And they were also concerned with subsidies, where the Chinese would set up some industries, and then these industries benefit from subsidies, which would enable them to produce products below market rates. So this led to some anti-dumping. In the back of that report, there's probably the best statement on Chinese intellectual property theft, which describes the life cycle of IP theft. And it more or less goes of, get the plan of what you're going to do, go out and collect it by any and all methods, bring it back, your guys work on it, and then and assimilate it, and then you innovate beyond it. So that's recommended just to see what it is. So given that report, and then this brought on the trade conflict or dispute that we see today, those are the primary issues. And those are the issues required to have a sustainable international trade regime, because these kinds of practices really harken back to the 1930s. And what happened in the 1930s in other countries that felt damaged, they then responded, essentially in kind. So the United States, after 20 years of not knowing what to do, trying other kinds of approaches like the Xi-Obama agreement, which he collapsed by the beginning of the Trump administration, then respond in kind. And that's what we see Trump doing. And in these trade negotiations, they seem to be making progress. And then the report was that, a few weeks ago, that the most senior leadership pulled back and refused to go forward on moderating these kinds of aggressive policies. And when you think about it, when China was going forward, it was like another Asian tiger. And this had happened before with the Japanese, it happened with the Koreans, but the difference was that it was a much bigger country, and as the economy scaled up, this impact became more severe and essentially destabilized the trading system. So the way forward there would be to come to an agreement in order to keep the trading system going and avoid the kinds of consequences that descent into a 1930s situation would bring. That's the kind of the context environment.
Yeah.
And then you were speaking, and of course, when these talks fell apart, the tariffs which the United States had been withholding due to progress were then kicked up to the 20% level on 200 billion worth of exports. And then a couple of days later, then this designation of Huawei as a national security threat, and it was put on an entities list, so-called, and then companies with any U.S. intellectual property were required to have a license in order to sell technologies containing that IP to Huawei. This is sort of like the ZTE episode in the previous year, and it looks sort of devastating that it may really collapse this company, which is a $100 billion a year company, which across many sectors, and not just, the 5G. They make switches for fiber optics and so forth, and they lay cable underseas, and they do many things. So in some sense, when you look at these companies and then you hear the talk of Chinese technological prowess, what it really is, it's prowess within a globalized technology plane, where you're actually leveraging all these components that they're not just from the US, from Europe, all these different countries that have something, and you bring it together and then you build your entity. So that's sort of a collective, if you will, economic you know, fabric that's producing these champions. And so you might think if from a sustainable development point of view, that it's important to maintain that fabric so that companies can develop. I'll go back to you on this.
So, going back to your point about the Chinese looking at the Western things and learning from that, I think the biggest example of that would be the Belt and Road Initiative, where they looked at what the United States did for Europe after the Second World War in terms of the Marshall Plan, and they just thought that this can be replicated, but on a much bigger scale and with a Chinese characteristic kind of a model, and that's how they filled in that kind of need for these smaller countries around their neighborhood, which wanted something kind of infrastructure financing, and they went and offered those loans to these companies. And I think the other way they also look at.
Let me jump in on that for a
Yeah.
moment. So the joke is, what's the difference between British imperialism and One Belt, One Road?
Oh.
So the answer is the Chinese make you pay for the railroad. But
That's
but
correct.
seriously, it's an intelligent idea, and when you think about it, the Chinese drove their economy through overinvestment.
Yes.
Investment was something like 55%, and they put a lot of effort into building infrastructure, and they built a lot of railroads, and they, of course, stole the railroad technology from the various Europeans, and then, innovated beyond it. But they had this excess capacity because they really didn't need more roads to nowhere. And so what to do? So the obvious thing was, let's sell it to somebody else. But as you do that, and you're building an infrastructure for international trade that lowers the transaction costs to trade with China, and also lowers the transaction costs for countries to, engage in the world economy. So that's a good point, and you will get development. We know that, in economic development, activities spin out from growth poles. So if you have trade centers, activities build up around those trade centers, around those products and kinds of things that are produced, and extend out. So actually building that infrastructure will then create economic development around these sort of entrepot points on these infrastructures. So it's not an all bad idea, but it was really ironic. I asked the question, well, does the electronic infrastructure come with it? Do you put fiber optic when you build the railroad? And the answer is no, it's already there. We don't want to draw attention to it. But anyway, you were going to say...
So, the other point that I wanted to mention was, of course, there's also some conscious attempt to rewrite talking about the world order, at least to start with the financial system which undergirds the current trading system, which is the Bretton Woods institutions. If you look at, for instance, the early on in sometime in 2013 and 14, when the new development bank was set up, the BRICS bank was set up, and then that experiment did not take off. They looked at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I think that was a very clever attempt to make sure that that as they seal their dominance in this digital economy, in this world economy, there are those other institutions which will make sure that this Chinese dominance is further backed by that institutional architecture.
So there are those that argue that the deep strategy of the Communist Party has been to overturn the international or world capitalist system. And there's some writing on that, and I was speaking to Joe Nye, who reported on somebody who studied that. And apparently it's becoming, more overt. I think that may be the case among the more ideological elements, but it doesn't envision what the actual complexity of undertaking such a project. But in terms of economic development or, building yourself up to be a superpower, targeting all those elements of sort of global power makes a lot of sense. And so we can see the footprint of the model.
So I think for us, the only question that now probably will continue to emerge is that till the time the Chinese achieve that kind of dominance, or maybe they're on that path to dominance, how do you engage? Should we engage or should we confront China? And I think in that manner, if you look at, particularly in the cyberspace, the 2015 agreement between President Obama and President Xi about containing the commercial espionage, the cyber-enabled commercial espionage, was a pretty important agreement because there was some expectation that this kind of behavior then can be managed, but obviously I think that did not last long.
So in the current dispute, my understanding is from U.S. officials is that if the Chinese were to agree to the three issues to handle that, it would go back to the early 2000s. So they would be welcomed and engaged. And I think, we need to stand firm collectively on too much aggression in the economic space or other spaces, and then welcome them when they have responsible behavior.
That's true.
And I think you have to do the two, because if you don't, they have poor feedback mechanisms from the general population to the leadership. And when you're just trying to make policy yourself and everyone tells you what you want to hear, it's not clear that you will engage in the best, most effective kind of learning.
And I think many of these issues are also determined by the overall US-China dynamics, as well as, we didn't speak about the other major power, which is Russia. Between the three of them, I think the dynamics also determine what happens in this particular space.
Yeah, so if we walk it back to the security level, you have an arms race underway between U.S., Russia, China. The U.S. was late to wake up. Russians have conducted a $700 billion, rearmament over 10 years, modernized many of their forces. The U.S. has embarked on a modernization program for $1 or $2 trillion on their nuclear weapons if they hadn't done anything for decades. And the Chinese have been marching along with 10% increases, in their military capacity. So you've got that as a background. You lack arms control agreements are falling apart in order to keep it in check. On top of that, you have cyber and security dilemmas where the offensive, dominance of the space leads to an arms race in that cyber area. And all of these tend to poison policy thinking, because you start making policy based on worst case analyses. And then that empowers the hardliners at the security level. And if we look back to the US-China relationship, people were saying, well, the ballast is the economic interdependence. That keeps the rest of it on track. And countries are deterred by entanglement, that they shouldn't break the economic layer. But now that's actually turning into a point of friction and dispute which means it can propagate across all the other verticals if it's unchecked.
Interesting times ahead. Let's see what happens. Yeah.
Well, they're interesting times, and they could go very poorly. And it's a time when we need to have real statesmen and real foreign policy scholars and architects figuring out how we managed this world order, because the weaponry that we have today is much more powerful than we had in World War II. And so were we to have major engagements by major powers, it would be very bad for the planet. So if we want to keep going forward, then we need to understand how to manage it and how to dial back aggressive tendencies. I'll just say one more thing about this, which is there's an international relations theory called lateral pressure developed by Nazli Shukri and Robert North. And it's essentially a rewrite of Lenin's theory of imperialism minus the Marxist piece, so it's sort of a systems theory one. And what it says is that nations go out internationally in order to satisfy domestic demands, and they can't be satisfied domestically. And so if it's the case that demands are too great on China internally, that it has to pursue more aggressive economic policies and other kinds of policies externally, it may be very difficult for policymakers to moderate the behavior even with the best of intentions.
Thank you.